Broadcasting live. It's America's longest running talk show on computers. It's Computer America, bringing you the biggest names in technology with guest interviews, new products, and your emails. Listen live at computeramerica.com on any device around the world. Email the show at live@computeramerica.com or find us on social media. Be sure to check out our website for contests, giveaways, show notes, live video stream, podcasts, and more. You're listening to Computer America.
Hello and welcome into the Computer America Show. We are the nation's longest running and nationally syndicated radio talk show on computers and technology. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Ben Crossman, and everyone, hey, welcome into the program. So today on the show, we have a very special treat for you because we are going to be talking to a company called Hu-manity.co, and we'll get to them in just a minute. But yeah, everyone, welcome into the show. Hopefully you're having a great day and you are ready for some Computer America. Everything is going well. Everything is going fine. And yeah, you're ready for the show. So with that being said, obviously first things first, computeramerica.com. That's where you'll find everything, including the show notes, a link to our guest website, all that kind of thing. You can find it at computeramerica.com. Also, be sure to check out the live video stream as well as the chat room. And on top of that, articles, news, reviews, everything that you need to know at computeramerica.com. Just anything related to us can be found at our website. So with, let's see, so no real other announcements. In the second part of the program, we will be doing computer and technology news. In the first, our interview, and I think we're just going to go ahead and jump right into that. So everyone, here we go. Now, everyone, our guest today is none other than Hu-manity.co. If you haven't heard of them, then you are in luck. This is the best show for you because we're going to hear all about what they do, what they're about, and their mission. As we discussed with the CEO of the company, just what data should mean to you and what data and what kind of role that plays in today's business, society, so on and so forth. This is something that does come up often. The fact that we are kind of getting desensitized by all the breaches, the hacks, the loss of personal information, the loss of personal data, or even just the mass collection of our data. It's really easy to say, well, who cares? Or, well, it's out there, so what difference does it make? This is the show that I think, I hope that we enlighten you and show that, this isn't okay. And just the continuation of what's been happening, we need to scrutinize. We need to take a look at that. So as I said before, joining us is Hu-manity.co, Hu-manity.co, and we'll have a link to that in the show notes at computeramerica.com. But yeah, joining us today is none other than Mr. Richie Etwaru. He is the CEO of the company. And Richie, welcome on to Computer America.
Hello, everyone, and Ben, thanks for having me.
Our pleasure, our pleasure. So I gave a little bit of an introduction, but I'm sure you could give it much better. Give us some background on Hu-manity, Hu-manity.co, and give us some background on yourself. How did you get working on a project like this?
Oh, thanks. Well, I've been plagued, so to speak, by this problem of us not owning our data for about 20 years. I'd had an interesting set of shifts in my career where I've always sort of been in a company or been founding a company or been in a community where it had something to do with policy and data. And this idea that human beings should have ownership of our data, similarly to how we own our car. and have a title of ownership, or own our land and have a title of ownership, is one that's been gradually increasing over time, right? This is not something that is a, sudden reaction from some of the violations that we're seeing, whether it's Cambridge Analytica or anything like that. This has been a gradual process. I personally, have been in technology and in ventures for a long time. I've spent time in healthcare. I've spent time in financial services. My first startup company that I ever built was responsible for buying driver data from the Department of Motor Vehicles across the country and selling that data to transportation companies, large trucking companies, so that they could make sure that the drivers are safe to comply with federal law. And it was around that time and in that experience that I recognized that the drivers whose data is in this sort of supply chain, if I may, right, this entire process here of moving the data around, that those drivers should know that their data is being used. They should have choice and control around how it's being used. And more importantly, if there were profits that being made from that data, that those drivers should be offered an opportunity to share in those profits. Now, that was 20 years ago. Driver data is a small subset of the entire, what we call the human data marketplace, which is about $250 billion today. That includes your healthcare data, your geolocation data, obviously your social media data and your browsing habits and stuff like that. But it's a large problem today. It was a microscopic problem 20 years ago, and it's only getting bigger and bigger. And we can talk through some of the nuances of that. But that's a really brief introduction of myself and how I'm operating here. Right. And from a company standpoint, our purpose is to help consumers take ownership of their data.
So, tons to break down here. Let's the first one that kind of comes to mind is that you were comparing data to something that you should have ownership over, because let's face it, a lot of the data that you mentioned, it's very intrinsic. Like let's say medical data, there's no changing your medical history. Once that data is out there, you can't just say, you know what, I'm just going to get a new set of medical data and, it can be whatever. No, the data is hard and set. So my question is like, even though, let's say it's out there, you were comparing to things like land or a car or things that you can't just Control-C, Control-V, copy and paste and duplicate and multiply over and over and over again. Those are, I guess, part of their value comes from the fact that, one car is one car. If you could duplicate that into a second car, it'd be less valuable. Data can be copied and traded and, collected by multiple parties. How would you kind of propose that you can actually get data attributed to a person and, kind of say that, hey, I don't have the rights to this data. Hey, I don't have permission to use this data because, it can be duplicated, and that's kind of hard to control, the duplication and spread of that.
Yeah, so there's two, you're absolutely right. There are two components there. One is that data is called a non-rivalrous asset. Which means that other people could use it, or multiple people could use it at the same time without rivaling the value that each has. So it's non-rivalrous. Whereas something like oil is a rivalrous asset, right? If I sell a gallon of oil to someone, I can't sell it to the next person, all right? So that's one construct. And we will come back to that as to how will human beings be able to deal with that notion. But the other is the notion of ownership and property. So when we think about ownership and we think about property, most of us think about tangible property. So our land, right? We have a title of ownership of it. You can lease it. You can pass it off into your estate. If you donate it, you get a tax write-off. Same thing with your car. You have a title of ownership. There's also intellectual property. For example, if you were to write a book, the book is your property. And books are obviously copyable and replicatable. Right. If you were to draw a piece of art, same thing. If you were to create the score of music, same construct. Your music is your property. Your art is your property. Your books are your property. Now, we don't usually think about that as property. When we think about property, we only think about the tangible things, such as land and car. But there is a framework for owning your intellectual property. What we are playing out is the same pattern historically that happened that gave us ownership of our creativity, which is our intellectual property, so our art and our music, and gave us agency over our labor. And let me share with that a little bit, because I think the audience would appreciate the historical context. This notion that we are setting forth here at Hu-manity.co, that consumers should pool together and be able to come to the table and take ownership of their data, this is not a new pattern of consumers pooling together. This pattern has at least played out twice before in human history. In the 1600s, this pattern played out around our creativity. So you ever heard the phrase starving artist, right? Around the 1600s, there was this whole notion that says, hey, we're like, if you don't pay us for our writing and you don't pay us for our art and you don't pay us for our music, art will not thrive. Like, artists are starving. And that gave us early things like the statutes of monopolies, which actually led to intellectual property laws today, and human beings own their creativity, right? Mm-hmm. Same thing played out in the 1800s around labor. So slavery was, well documented in history, and it was the same thing. Humans had to come together and said, hey, man, my productivity, it belongs to me, right? I should share in some of that value when my productivity creates whatever it was at the time, cotton or sugarcane or whatever it was, and we have labor laws. And both of those times, it was the consumers that got together and approached the table and said, hey, guys, we need ownership. We're playing out the same pattern again, but we're playing it out around our data, right? So that's the first part of it, the ownership and the property rights and the historical pattern. The point that you made around data being non-rivalrous is one that is interesting, because the way we are bringing a solution to market is that we're bringing a solution to market which is essentially track and trace. So when consumers engage with our app, they claim a property interest on their data. They get a title of ownership. That title of ownership comes with a unique identifier. Think of it as like your serial number on your car or your title ID for your house. Mm-hmm. It's a unique identifier for your data. And what we do on the consumer's behalf is we work with corporations that collect and sell that consumer data to add that title ID to it to serve as a lookup. So whenever that data is found downstream, that title ID will always point back to the individual, where companies that are using that data can use that title ID to go, let me see if Ben wants his data used or not. Maybe Ben doesn't want to use his data. Or let me see if Ben is interested in giving me explicit permissions to use his data in exchange for a free service or some form of consideration. Right. So we're layering track and trace on top of it, which deals with the non-rivalrous aspects of data.
There's and I feel like this is how this conversation is going to go, is that I feel like every reply that you have, there's going to be, well, I have 5 more questions. The first one, let's say the point that you just made with the, and we're going to talk about your app that you have here, the hashtag My31, and available for Android and iPhone as well. But and just how that works. But real quick, just about that. We have something kind of similar, and I wanted to know how you plan on enforcing this. If it's just, hopefully something like Hu-manity.co becomes an industry standard and it gets picked up and adopted, through a grassroots movement, which would be great. But we already have something in browsers called Do Not Track, and I feel like people misconstrue that, because you can turn that on and you can say, hey, and most websites pick up the fact that a user has that enabled or not, and regardless, it's up to the website and the service that you're visiting to either acknowledge that and kind of consent to that, or they can say, well, we don't care, and we're going to keep collecting data about you. And so, it's kind of like an opt-in, opt-out policy. If you feel like being morally just, you can you can heed the Do Not Track kind of flag there, but otherwise there's no forcing someone to. Are you just adding the tool to make this possible, and then hopefully this becomes adopted, or do you have some way of, how are you hoping that this becomes kind of enforceable?
It's a really, really good question. So, by the way, I love the Do Not Track tools, right? And I love the ad blockers, and they're fantastic, right?
Of course.
The issue is that all you need is one leak for your data to be out there, right? So let's say it's your healthcare data, for example, right? So, and you go to 10 doctors over the last 10 years. 9 of those doctors may have very strict policies where the software that they use to collect notes on you, the relationship they have with the software company is that those software companies are not allowed to de-identify your medical records and sell it, right? So 9 of them do that. But for the one that does it, you have a leak, right? Mm-hmm. And that software company can de-identify your record and sell it, right? So unless you have a do not track or do not trace, right, or do not share across all of your engagements, as we live as digital citizens, you're probably going to have a leak somewhere. And once you have a leak, your data is out there, right? And somebody is monetizing it, somebody's using. Our solution is to mark your data with a watermark of ownership so that whenever that data is found downstream, no matter how it leaked or not, whenever it's found downstream, it now has this lookup key that will always point back to your consent and your preferences, however you set them today or however you choose to set them a year from now. So that's the pattern. Your question about compliance is a little bit more interesting. So what I think most of us don't know is that the companies that use our data, let's say healthcare again, right? So a research company would use our data to try to find a cure for some sort of rare disease, for example, right? And that's a really noble cause. Right. But there's also commercial use of the data, right? Where they would use it to figure out where to place advertising, right? Or where to deploy sales reps to doctors and stuff like that. Those companies that are using the data, those companies would love to have some sort of agreement with the consumer's data, who they're using, to have the explicit permission to use it, because it helps them comply with the law a little bit better, okay? It also helps them potentially improve that data quality, because the quality of the data that they're getting is probably incomplete or it's probably inconsistent. But having a relationship with Ben or having a relationship with anyone in the audience where your consent may say, hey, I'm willing to have you use my data and I'm happy to complete it for you or answer a few questions about it, but in exchange, you have to give me some consideration. There are many companies that want to be better around their data posture. There are many companies that want to be more compliant around their data posture. And it's not just because they want to do good. It's also because they want to do well. Because having that relationship allows them to improve the quality of their data. So from a compliance standpoint of how do we make sure that this thing is complied with, it's not a stick per se. It's more of a carrot, right? To say, well, I'm using 100,000 people's records. Most of it is crap, but here's 30,000 people that are willing to have this transparent relationship with me where I can improve the data and have a better compliance posture. That's where we're seeing these corporations that want to be on the right side of history stand up and say, enough is enough. We don't want to be the Cambridge Analytica of our industry. Let's start talking to the people.
Yeah, and that really does make a lot of sense. I mean, we have everyone from, like, let's just take IBM Research on the show, and they do so much with user data that something that came up often was that the better the data that you put into artificial intelligence, machine learning, whatever algorithm you want to call it, but the better the data you put in, the better the result you get out. And that can be everything from voice assistants to translation to, just general user data. So I see where it is, and I like that it's a carrot and not a stick. That makes a lot of sense. Now, going back a little bit into our conversation, one thing I wanted to kind of ask you, and this is, we've talked about this on the show before, where the internet was adopted kind of slowly. People kind of blogged online because they heard that you could share videos and you could read news and you could do XYZ. No one really thought of the implications of the way the internet was structured, what you could actually collect on people, so on and so forth. And I feel like when the internet started, it wasn't about data collection. Now, it certainly is. Like you mentioned, it's a huge multi-billion-dollar industry, and the collection of data is one of the most profitable parts of having a website. That's not why most people adopted it. And I guess my question with that is, throughout history, you mentioned things like books and intellectual property and, slave labor and, having the rights to the labor. The problem with data, and a little bit of a differentiation, is that the data that's collected in a lot of ways it just exists. It's just that Ben is a 28-year-old white male, and he goes to these websites, and this is what he talks about with his friends. I guess I made that to some extent, but I didn't purposefully intend to make that. It's just me existing. Is there some kind of differentiation that people should really be concerned about? Because I think a lot of people are like that. You know, they don't see the value in something that just kind of spontaneously exists, as opposed to something that they consciously created, like a book, like, you know, backbreaking labor. Should people really, you know, value the data that they don't necessarily intend to create?
Well, I think there's a lot of questions there, and there's probably about 3 or 4 there. So let's try to parse them sequentially, right?
Sure.
You know, the whole idea of this problem sort of creeping up on us, right, is consistent with the other humanitarian issues of history. So, you know, slavery in the early days, and if you look back at some of the recordings of it, right, it wasn't initially a humanitarian issue. Right, there were certain aspects of the world and certain deployments of slavery where it was sort of proposed as a decent bargain in the beginning, right? Mm-hmm. Which is, you'll work for me, and you know, you'll get free, et cetera, right? Mm-hmm. But over time, it continues to become an improper fraction, right? Even writing of books on arts, right? Initially, it was like, this is great, I can write books, or I can draw art, and it's for the benefit of the people, and it's fantastic. But after a while, it becomes an improper fraction, and business models change, right? Slave labor was the business model before paid labor, right? Mm-hmm. And that changes over time. So we have sort of gradually sort of gotten ourselves here exactly how we've gotten into other humanitarian crises, and we're a smart species. Like, we would never, like, if this was to happen to us over a 2-year period, we would notice it, right? But because we're being boiled as frogs most of the times, right, we don't notice it. Secondly, there's a business model shift coming. Most of the technology companies that sit right now and use this strategic natural resource freely without sharing that value back are going to have to figure out a consumer-inclusive data economy business model. And we're starting to see early indications of that. To your point, though, around the active creation of the data versus the passive creation of the data,
sure,
and the value of that data to an individual versus the value of the data to the commons, this is where, you know, we really need to parse the language very carefully. So, active versus passive. When you think about the data marketplace, you know, there are things like your social media data, which, to be honest, does not have that much value to you, right? If you were to, if Facebook was to share back with everyone the value from everyone's social media data, it probably would barely buy you a cup of coffee every month, right? Because there's so many people on there. And there's you know, it becomes a small amount back to the individual. But if you take a look at something like your healthcare data, right, particularly if you're someone who is, you know, very unique, whether you have multiple diseases and indications or you have a specific genetic mutation, the value of your data could be significantly valuable, right? Mm-hmm. To the extent of $1,000 a year, right? We're seeing an average around $10 a month around healthcare data, right? So there's value there above and beyond what we think about, right? Secondly, from this notion of the commons versus individual benefit. So there are data sets that we will continually want to share for the commons. For example, you know, my sensor data, right? Because that benefits the commons, right? Or, you know, traffic patterns. I love the contract of knowing how long it's going to take to get home, right? When I get in my car and my phone connects to my Bluetooth. That's a benefit of the commons. But I don't have a choice right now as to whether my data is contributed to the commons or not. It is a forced contribution into the commons. And what property law does is it classifies the data in such a way where you have choice around it, right? Now, if we get to the active versus passive, yes, there are passive data sets that we create that are very valuable, that are not valuable, and then there are active data sets. So if you think about healthcare data again, or if you think about your credit reporting data, right? Some of this stuff is being manufactured from a transaction that you paid for, right? So with Facebook, you know, you get a service back for free. But with my healthcare data, I paid my doctor, I paid my pharmacist, I paid my labs, whether it's through direct insurance or some sort of employee contribution insurance, I'm paying and it's a byproduct of that transaction that I paid for, which is my data that's being monetized by a software company who writes software that the doctors use. So I'm not even in contract with the software company that's monetizing it. So it's not a one blanket statement that says all data should be controlled, all data should be monetized. What property does is it takes the data from this sort of like, floating world where we don't know what it is, we don't know what the rules are, we're not sure how it should be done. And it very, very clearly in black and white delineates the ownership and puts the choice and control in the hands of the consumer.
That is important because up until this point, data in a lot of ways has been kind of the wild, wild west, where if you can collect it, if you can get your hands on it, good for you. You can monetize it however you feel like. And there's definitely a shift coming. Now, I'm kind of curious how, and I hate to use the phrase pie in the sky, but how idealist you get, because even though we are a technology show, not looking to get too much into the politics of it all, but there have been, mentions of, well, at least here on the show, our conversations usually revolve around the idea of automation, people losing their jobs, the fact that there aren't going to be jobs to replace them, and then enters the idea of a universal basic income and how are people going to be paid in the future. I believe it was Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, mentioned something along the lines of paying people for their data, kind of like I think we're alluding to here, but yeah, I mean, you mentioned the data economy of the future and how people will get paid for it. Is this something that you see as, this will be like in addition to all the other labor and all the other kind of stuff? Like, is this the introduction to a real big societal shift that your data, just because you are sharing your data and you are helping push forward, these companies, you should be rewarded for that in some kind of real, tangible way?
Oh, absolutely. Our business model gets consumers paid hard cash.
There you go.
Right? So healthcare data, as we mentioned, is about $10 per month, right, on average for those who fit the interesting characteristics.
Will that and sorry to jump in here real quick, but do you think that'll go up in the future? Because that's the kind of going rate today. Do you think data and personal data will be more valuable in the future?
Without a doubt, and it doesn't even have to be in the future. It's happening right now, right? With all of the IoT devices that we are sort of owning as our property, by the way, that are creating data streams. All these data streams are being monetized, right? So let's abstract out for a second. I think first of all, the Mark Zuckerberg statements. Let's not be foolish, right? Mark Zuckerberg has a business model that has expired over time.
Yeah.
He's created an unnecessary spike in human vanity with the platforms that have been assembled under the Facebook group, and to be honest, he's trying to wiggle himself out of it, right? So let's call a spade, right? From a business model perspective, the consumer-inclusive data economy is the business model of the future because data is the strategic natural resource of our generation. It has the GDP implications of land, oil, or salt, right? And we have to recognize that both land, oil, and salt had to attribute value back to the people. You can't just amass the value in corporations or in monarchies or with oligarchs and monarchs, right? Because you create an unnecessary spike in distribution of value. I'm not saying that value should be spread out like peanut butter. Right. I'm saying we need equitable, sustainable distributions of value, right? So from a data income perspective, you hit on a very, very important point here. One of the things is that the data is being used to train algorithms to automate human jobs, okay? Mm-hmm. And we do run the risk here of having a useless class, not even an unemployable class, a useless class, because academia and our pedagogy is not ramping up in time to train the next generation for the jobs of the future as the entry-level jobs get automated. So it's our data being used to automate our jobs, and we don't have control, again, over how that data is being used. But what this income presents is not basic income, it presents passive income. So I don't see the data income as universal basic income, which is essentially a tax handout. Mm-hmm. I see it as filling the gap of universal basic income as universal passive income, which comes from the consumer, and it comes with dignity. Right? Yeah. One of the things about universal basic income is it doesn't come with dignity. Right? Universal passive income from your data comes with dignity. And I think that's the high-level socioeconomic historic correction that we will see here as we think about how we deal with this new strategic natural resource that has the magnitude to implicate the world, such as how something like salt or oil or land implicated our civilization.
Very, very interesting. And one other kind of thing I want to get into, we have a question here about the UN, but before we get into actually the idea of adopting a 31st human right, and we'll let you get into that. And I think from there we'll transition into the app and what you can do in the app. But I think, and I'm sure you might be able to correct me on this, the UN has recognized that access to communication, and I think that includes the internet, is a basic human right. You know, the idea that you can get on the internet, you can have a phone, you can communicate with people in today's day and age, that's a basic right. So if the internet is a basic right, if people being able to get on and, you know, either voluntarily or involuntarily share all the data, do you think that the 31st, you know, the 31st human right that you're kind of proposing here with hashtag My31, do you think this is just a natural progression of that? That, hey, if people have a right and they're going to, and the future is going to heavily depend on the internet, it's time to adopt something like this.
Well, I think so. So the UN has 30 human rights, and they don't talk about the internet. There are other quote unquote rights organizations that, you know, think like the Internet Governance Forum, et cetera, that talk about the human rights. And there's quite a bit of Silicon Valley CEOs who recognize that their business models are burning, who are suddenly calling for human rights as a parachute to get out of the press nightmare. Right?
Oh,
but the UN does not recognize the right to the internet as a human right.
And what I was kind of remembering, and this was way back in 2011, so I apologize, but UN report declares internet access a human right, as in they're saying that disconnecting people through, think of like the Arab Spring and things like that, disconnecting people from communicating with one another was the issue. Not that the internet is a right, but denying communication was the grievance.
Correct. That is absolutely precise, right?
Yeah.
But of the 30 human rights that were there, they were ratified in 1948.
Right.
And they have never changed, right? And the internet was not a thing in 1948, right?
Of course.
There's never been a change to the language of the Declaration of Human Rights for the last 70 years, right? Which means it's probably something that we want to revisit, right?
Yeah.
We see the access to the internet as obviously a right. But the issue that we see that needs to be solved is that we don't have ownership of our data. And that's why we're trying to solve the problem at the top of the spear, so to speak. So if you think about the problem stack here, Ben, right, what do we got? We have a situation where, we've got B2C contracts that we all clicked I accept into, including myself, and I'm sure you as well, right?
Course.
I remember the day I gave up my data, right? I popped an AOL CD into an IBM Optiva, right, with a 14.4 modem, right, and I dialed up, and that's the day I started giving it away, right?
Yeah.
If you think about the stack of the problem, there's a B2C contractual problem at the bottom of the stack. There's a business model problem above that. There's a regulatory framework at the sovereign level, so country level above that. There is a treaty framework above that. And then there is the United Nations or the World Economic Forum or the OECD above that does not recognize that human data, which is inherently ours, comes from us and would not be there without our existence, and hence it's our property. So that's why we're trying to solve the problem at the top of the stack, so to speak, with a human right. But there's lots of things that are missing in the 30 human rights that we have, right? There's lots of things that are in the future that are not accounted for. And I think, we're going to see eventually, at least in my lifetime, the United Nations will reopen the Declaration of Independence, which just has not changed, the Declaration of Human Rights, which has not changed in 70 years. And we may end up with 45 or 50 human rights sometime within the next 10 years.
Right. And by the way, this so far, this seems rife for something that has been happening over the past couple of years. I'm surprised that the idea of, that you haven't said something like, oh, this is a movement to personalize data using the blockchain. Like there has been no speak of any kind of blockchain or any kind of online ledger. What kind of led you to that? Because and I think from here we're gonna move into the app and what the app actually does. But yeah, you kind of avoided one of the pitfalls that we've seen here, which is the flavor of the month, the term of the day, blockchain, privacy, crypto, whatever. You avoided that. Was that a conscious decision, or did that just never really play into what you were trying to do?
Well, look, we use blockchain in the architecture to essentially create a capability where, you know, the documents that are created on your behalf to claim a property interest on your data, okay, and the title of ownership and your choice and consent and use preferences are on a blockchain, so that for a heterogeneous network of participants, whether it be doctors or banks or pharmaceutical companies or marketing companies that want to be on that chain, to look up your consent when they see the key is easier and simpler for them to adopt, right? One of the benefits of blockchain is that if you have a heterogeneous network of parties, right, governments, large corporations, small corporations, people that all have to be on the same system, everyone doesn't have to have an Informatica, you know, ETL license. Everyone doesn't have to have Oracle or SQL Server databases, right? Everyone doesn't have to have MuleSoft APIs, and everyone doesn't have to buy Salesforce.com, right? It's easy to install the chain code to be in an immutable, very, very standardized environment where we can understand the data, and the ecosystem could grow, could extract or constrict very easily.
I gotcha.
And that's one of the main reasons why we use blockchain here. But to lead with blockchain, and we are in some ways decentralizing the agreement, right? We're building a decentralized agreement around who owns human data. But to lead with a blockchain narrative in any of these things would be equivalent to, 10 years ago, saying that Uber is exciting because it's using GPS.
Right.
Right. It's not the lead of the show. There are many other things in the technology stack. Some of the stuff that we do around KYC is very innovative. Some of the stuff that we do around making sure, that the preferences that are set within the architecture, that those preferences are consistent with the data sets that were marked for property interest. Those are very, very innovative technologies. So I don't see any reason to highlight blockchain. Similarly, like I don't, go about describing an application as sophisticated because it uses Amazon Web Services, right? It's just another tool in the toolkit. What I think is differentiating here is that we have built an app where consumers can pool together and claim property interest on something that comes inherently from us without having to get off the sofa, without having to get out of the house, without having to print a sign or make a picket and go march down Pennsylvania Avenue. This is a movement on an app. And we're using technology in a very, very nuanced way to bring consumers together into a collective formation to take ownership of something that's rightfully ours.
It's the one thing I would caution there is that we saw something very similar with the FCC, and we covered that very extensively with the net neutrality debate. And when people made it too easy to send in a form letter, to put it, just punch in your name, your email address, and digitally sign here, and we'll do all the rest for you. That was quickly and probably illegally ignored by the FCC. I think people need to be capable of going out and picketing, but hey, getting the word out and getting something like My31 out there is an important first step. But I don't want to discount the impact of actually seeing people take to a movement. That's very important. So it's a combination of two, right? One of the things that we're doing here is that we're making sure that we do KYC on the consumers. So like your cat can't claim your data as your property, right? Because we go through know your customer processes, right? Which makes sure that their identity is validated and you are who you are, because you're getting a legal document here of a property interest on your data. Mm-hmm. The other part of it is that we are bringing the corporations to the table that want to operate in a more transparent and a more trusted way. Right.
So we're almost self-implementing, so to speak, right, the pattern without waiting for regulations to change.
Right, and absolutely. So let's go ahead, and this interview is, if I'm not careful, it's going to go past an hour. Let's go ahead and talk about the app. And right there, watching the video portion, we are of course going to, kind of show you can get it on the iTunes and the Google Play Store. But talk about the app. Let's say someone goes out, they download it. I believe it's free to download, and walk us through what's possible, what's capable, and what they would do with the app. Just kind of walk us through the app.
So on the Apple platform as well as the Android platform, I think that's the first. Second, it is free to download. It is significantly user friendly. The design team put a lot of time into the UI UX. So the steps are the following: you create an account, you verify that you are who you are. You claim, so we're starting with healthcare data. You claim a property interest in your healthcare data, which basically asks you a set of questions around whether you want to claim your data as your property. Once you claim your interest on your data, you then set your preferences around it that says you might choose that you don't want your data ever to be used if someone were to find it. You might choose that you want it to be used, but only for good, for example, for research for certain diseases. You may choose that you want it to be used, but only partially. For example, my preference is have my psychiatric data out, but you can have my oncology data, right? But not my psychiatric data. Like, I think it's okay that people assume that I'm crazy, but I don't want them to know that I see a shrink, right?
Right.
And then you can definitely set preferences that says if you find my data and you are using it and you would like to contact me for data improvement or for explicit permission or to ask me questions about it, here are the terms of what I'd like to be compensated with. I'm willing to lease you that relationship for a year, and in exchange, it's $10 a month or $12 a month or $14 a month or whatever the case may be. So you set all those permissions on there, right? Once you set those permissions, we now start to work with organizations to notify them that you've set your permissions around your data, and they will use the title ID to mark your data for ownership. Over time, as your data continues to get used and it gets found in supply chains along the way, corporations that would find it, that wants to open up that relationship with you, will then notify you via the app. Once the notification happens, we open up that beautiful, very, very, well-protected, consented layer, and the value starts to exchange. You might get asked a survey in exchange for income. You might lease your explicit permission for a year in exchange for income. We facilitate that transaction. We do not get paid unless the consumer gets paid. So all of the thousands of people that are on the app right now that have laid out their data listing, think about it as listing your property, right, for leasing, right, that have laid out their data listings. We don't have any income from that. Whenever there's a corporation that is willing to pay that consumer for that explicit use of it, or for the permission to use it, or the completion of it to accelerate research in healthcare, whatever the case may be, that's the only time we get paid a platform fee from the corporation.
Gotcha. Now, there's so some of the things is here. I mean, if your mission really takes off, I would say that the really kind of the end result of a movement like this is that you kind of become defunct, wouldn't you think? Like, if the UN passes, Human Rights 31, and this becomes industry standard, and people have a right to their own data. We've already seen things like that with European Union just passed the one that makes you have to click, hey, we collect your data. Do you accept cookies? And it's totally slipping my mind what that is, but.
GDPR.
Yeah, GDPR, correct. So yeah, and like the end result of all this, might just be kind of that. Hey, your company kind of, I guess, transitions to something else. Becomes a consumer advocacy group. You mentioned payment, and I'm sorry for jumping topic like this, but actually, let's go ahead and let you respond. If this all goes well, you kind of go defunct, don't you? Because then this just becomes, kind of legislation.
Yeah, so legislation will create a marketplace, and that marketplace will need a clearinghouse, so to speak, right? So if you think about the Cartesian product of hundreds of millions of people that could have, microscopic leases to thousands of corporations at the same time, it's a pretty complex Cartesian product of leases and transactions and value exchange. So there has to be some sort of utility that will bill and meter and account for those transactions, right? Over time, I think, and by the way, Hu-manity.co is not the only company in this space. There are other companies in this space which I welcome, I encourage, and I cheerlead for, because it's important that the category happens. It's important that the course correction happens. And from a corporate perspective, we'll sort out, right, who wins in the end and what that looks like, right? But this category has to happen. I think that Hu-manity.co will become a utility in the end, right? We will be somewhat equivalent to the credit card clearing companies, you know, like Visa, for example, right? It's a credit card clearing pattern, so to speak. You don't get your credit card from Visa, you get your credit card from Chase. Visa is the clearinghouse under the or behind the scenes, so to speak. So I think that we become a utility eventually, where we would be the facilitator of the consent and the transactions and the various agreements along the way. Right. And, you know, we sort of blend into the infrastructure over time, as we should, as we should.
Makes perfect sense. And then the other point to that I wanted to ask was, so this is not a nonprofit. This is something that you're hoping that as people adopt and as you get more leverage, then you're able to work out a good deal between corporations that want to come to the table and your significant user base, and everyone wins in the end. But you are definitely for profit, correct?
We're a for-profit company. That is the current design of the company. I think the profit formation of a company is not something permanent, right? You could change from a for-profit to a non-profit. You could find some sort of blended structure, so to speak, right? Whether it's a B Corp or something like that. We're currently for-profit, right? Because we are making significant investments here to build out the infrastructure, to educate the masses, to bring the corporations together. There's a lot of work to be done. In this type of initial work, you know, it's really hard to sustain this type of initial work, particularly the capital that's needed if you take a nonprofit formation. Having said that, to our last conversation around the pattern that we're moving towards a utility, I think there is going to be a completely new design of corporations. Right? A lot of people talk about, you know, customer companies or employee-owned companies, customer-centric companies or employee-owned companies. We believe that we will become one of the world's first customer-owned utilities, where the consumers that are on our app will be shareholders in the company, and as a result, will have an interesting profit posture, right? Because we won't be a for-profit, we won't be a non-profit, and whatever profit we have will be shared back with our customers, right? As part of the ownership of the company. So we're on an evolution path here. I think at this stage where we are, today is actually our 1-year anniversary of incorporating the company, actually. So on the path that we're on, the for-profit shape and complexion is the most optimal to get these early investments. But I think over time, we will become a little bit more profit neutral over time. And I think the mechanism for us to do that will be a customer-owned utility. And we don't see a lot of those in the world today. And that's because this whole business model of doing good while doing well at the same time is something that's not popular.
There's certainly nothing wrong with for-profit, and like you mentioned, just to even compete in this marketplace, you have to start somewhere. So I'm not, you know, hey, this entire conversation is not begrudging people that you know, that they should earn money off of what they're doing, and you know, be that the individual earning money off of the data that they create, or a company such as Hu-manity.co being able to turn profit to, you know, kind of further their own goals. Hey, it all blends in together. So definitely not begrudging you anything like that. So I think with that,
well, we're one of the very few companies in the world where our business model is to get our customers paid.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So with that being said, Richie, I'm going to go ahead and let you have the last word. We're going to link to Hu-manity, Hu-manity.co. If anyone wants to go check it out, we'll link to that at Compute America. But I'll let you have the last word, Richie. If there's any place to go to get more information or anything people should do to find out more.
Well, I think the most important thing to do is to claim a property interest in your data via the app. Right. Data lives on forever. I personally want to pass on my data to my kids in my will and my estate. And to the extent that it has value 10, 15, 20, 30 years in the future, I want to make sure that they benefit from that value. So it's not just about today, and it's not just about the income. It's about recognizing that this is your property, and like all of your property, you should protect it, and you should start to think about how does it create value over time. My driving force, so to speak, is to make sure that my data is protected and I can pass it on.
There you go. There you go. And like I said, this conversation is coming up more and more and more as we do story after story. And this has been a very enlightening conversation, a very different take on it, and something that I hope to hear a lot more about. So everyone, once again, we have been talking to Mr. Richie Etwaru. He is the CEO of Hu-manity.co. And Richie, I want to thank you so much for coming on. This was a very interesting conversation. And everyone, let's go ahead and get into computer and technology news. So obviously, for our first story today, we are going to cover some of the big ones. And the first one, it's about Bitcoin. It's a touchy subject for some, but I definitely enjoy talking about Bitcoin because there are some strange things happening. If you don't recall, back in 2017, there were massive rallies where it went from just a couple of $1,000, $2,000 or $3,000, until it shot all the way up to $20,000, and then it became a household name. Everyone wanted to know, what is cryptocurrency, what is Bitcoin, and all together, just should I get involved with this? Because people were making millions and millions of dollars. Well, hey, maybe those days just aren't that far away, or maybe they are. Where just this morning, or I should say yesterday morning, Bitcoin actually rose about 15% overnight. Yes, very reminiscent of what happened back in 2017. And it rose all the way up to just barely under $5,000 per Bitcoin. That means that anyone who, let's say, that means about $1,000 of Bitcoin. If you were invested in it, you saw your investment shoot up about 15% overnight. And the reason I bring this up is because this one's strange. It's we have an article up about Bitcoin. Check it out at our website. But we, of course, always want to mention that the very beginning, our problem with Bitcoin was that it was subject to manipulation. And I'd be very interested to see if this is more the same, because that $20,000 spike that we saw back in 2017, a lot of people bought into it, hoping it would go even further, and no, they were all left holding the bag. I think that might be something that's happening yet again. And the reason that we say that is because it raised 15% in a single night because of one single order of Bitcoin. That's right. One analyst had a simple reason for Bitcoin price surge: a big $100 million order for the cryptocurrency that was placed overnight and spread across U.S. exchanges Coinbase and Kraken and Luxembourg's Bitstamp, saying that there has been a single order that has been algorithmically managed across 3 venues of around 20,000 Bitcoin. That's right. So one single person purchased 20,000 Bitcoin overnight, and that caused, of course, the supply and demand side. $100 million later, and you saw all the value of Bitcoin raise 15%. Obviously, this could be another situation, what happened back in 2017. I'd be very interested to see what's going to happen in the next couple of days if they sell off, and if anyone who bought into it, or if they're going to sell for a premium. This is just something that doesn't really happen with regular currency. This is a, kind of unique to cryptocurrency, and it might just be another manipulation. But like I said, Bitcoin, always a fascination, and definitely check that out. Okay, that was story number 1. Story number 2, let's go ahead and get into the Oscars. There's been a lot of criticism about the Oscars because the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences said that they wanted to limit the eligibility of streaming services for the Oscars. Obviously, things like Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime, even though they put out really good material that would be obviously in contention or be a contender for the Oscars, the Academy has said that they don't really care for it. They want traditional cinema to be the only cinema eligible for for awards, and streaming movies are not or should not be included. Well, guess who spoke up? Of all the people, the Department of Justice, yeah, you know them, has warned the Academy that rule changes limiting services like Netflix and Amazon might violate antitrust law if they effectively suppress competition. The Sherman Act bars anti-competitive agreements between rivals, the DOJ wrote, and that would include award restrictions that hurt a streaming company's sales. Because obviously, if a company touts that they've won X amount of awards and turns out that they can't claim that now because they were locked out of it, then maybe, hey, that would be a reason. They said that the Academy said that they received the DOJ notice and had responded accordingly, though didn't specify what the answer was. And all in all, Netflix and other streaming proponents have argued that it's vital to give online video equal consideration. It makes movies accessible to people who would not go otherwise, and enables both indie filmmakers as well as anyone whose project might be having trouble survive a blockbuster. Yeah, they could, of course, survive on streaming. And that's really one of the big things where the films that were often considered Academy favorites, the ones that win all the awards but maybe not fan favorites, they were seen in limited runtime. Not many people went to go see them. They just were in theaters just to be in theaters so that they qualified to actually win the award. And maybe that's where a lot of these movies would actually thrive. And even beyond that, even smaller films that don't have the backing of a larger publisher who would then get them into those movie theaters to even qualify. If they could qualify on Netflix, who does not have to answer to advertisers, who does not have to answer to any kind of blockbuster numbers, if Netflix deems it worthy to be on their platform, they put it on there, then again, the streaming services feel that, hey, they should just be eligible based on the film's credentials, on the merits of the film itself, regardless of how it did in theaters. This is what it should be judged on. So obviously the DOJ now stepping in and saying, hey, tread carefully because this may be anti-competitive behavior. Very, very different. And sorry to rush things along. I know that we spend a little bit longer on each story, but I wanted to get just a couple in here. And of course, I wanted to, hey, the interview took a while. Definitely appreciate that. But let's go ahead and talk about this last one. This one from the New York Times. We'll not have a chance to go over the entirety of it, but if you'd like to check it out, we will include a link to it in the show notes. But check this one out. This is another example of data being collected for the wrong purposes. This is from, again, the New York Times, Charlie Savage, saying that the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, secretly collected bulk records of money counter purchases. So think of those, those machines that you would find in a bank. They put in a bunch of money, and they would count them, tie them up, and you'd be good to go. Well, turns out not a lot of people need those. And unless you're running some sort of cash-based business, think bakery or something like that, yeah, drug dealers, I guess, need them because they deal in a cash-based business. And the DEA recognized this and enter the collection of bulk data, saying that they, and this is collecting data in bulk about Americans' purchases of money counting machines, and took steps to hide the effort from defendants and courts before quietly shuttering the program in 2013 amid the uproar over the disclosures by the National Security Agency, contractor Edward Snowden, and Inspector General report. So everyone remembers Edward Snowden, the whole NSA thing about the mass collection of data on American citizens, very unconstitutional, but hey, thank you, Patriot Act. I guess in the wake of that, they quietly began to move things under rugs and start to start to hide this program that it ever existed, because hey, you can't have all of your crap storms hitting at the same time. So, speaking of which, there's the music. Hey everyone, that's about all the time we have. So to get one more quick little tidbit in about this article, saying that seeking leads about who might be a drug trafficker, the D.E.A. started in 2008 to issue blanket administrative subpoenas to vendors to learn who was buying the money counters. The subpoenas involved no court oversight and were not pegged to any particular investigation. In other words, a severe overreach of power. So there you go. Again, full article in the show notes. Will include a link. And again, thank you to our guest, Hu-manity.co. Everyone, if you missed any part of today's program, check out the podcast, search Computer America. We should come right up. And in the meantime, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Be sure to tune in tomorrow, where we have the one, the only, Mr. Mike Cermak joining us. So always a fun time, and we'll catch you 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday. Everyone, have a good one.